Welcome back to the Perfectly Homeless podcast. We're continuing with the State Homeless Score project today.
Yeah, and we are getting close to wrapping this project, actually. Only 2 states left.
Right. And today's focus is Wisconsin. And just to set the stage for you listening, we are giving a score for this state's homeless efforts across a bunch of different categories.
But, and this is the important part, the score will evolve during the episode. It's not revealed all at once. We're going to build it in real time as we talk through the reality on the ground.
Exactly, because we want to look past the standard, national talking points. We want to measure the actual systems in place here, how people are actually experiencing a Wisconsin winter without a roof. So, to start, let's look at the sheer scale of the situation.
Right, the numbers are pretty stark.
Yeah, looking at the State Interagency Council on Homelessness, rent for a one-bedroom apartment in Wisconsin has surged 57% since 2013.
Which is massive.
It is. And the 2024 point-in-time count showed over 5,000 people experiencing homelessness on a single night, which is the highest they've seen since 2017. But the thing that really stopped me in my tracks in these sources, there are over 18,000 students in the state's public schools experiencing some form of homelessness.
Wow, yeah. It represents just a massive systemic failure. And, the way this crisis actually looked changes completely depending on the geography of the state.
Right.
I mean, the policy battles happening in an urban center like Madison, they look absolutely nothing like the sort of invisible struggles going on in the rural, dairy-heavy counties.
Okay, let's unpack this. We're grading 6 categories today. Housing affordability, shelter access, criminalization and enforcement, vehicle dwelling friendliness, outreach and social services, and pathways to permanent housing.
So let's start with the urban side, right?
Yeah.
Which blends those first 2 categories, housing affordability and shelter access.
Right. If you lose your apartment in Madison, how do you actually get into a shelter? The Northwest Wisconsin Community Services Agency uses this thing called coordinated entry.
Yeah, coordinated entry. It's actually mandated by HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and it completely rewrites how we historically handled housing assistance.
Because normally people think it's like a deli counter, right?
Yeah.
You just take a number and wait your turn. First come, first served.
Exactly, but coordinated entry throws that out the window. It uses this highly structured assessment to measure a person's physical and mental vulnerability.
So it's basically an emergency room triage system.
Yeah.
Like if you walk into an ER with a sprained wrist, but someone else gets carried in with a gunshot wound, the gunshot wound gets the bed, even if you've been in the waiting room for 3 hours.
That is a perfect analogy, yeah. So under coordinated entry, if you've got, say, a senior citizen sleeping in a snowbank with a medical condition, the system prioritizes them over a healthy 20-something who still has a couple of weeks before their eviction is final.
Which makes sense on paper.
It does. The intention is to prioritize the highest need so people don't literally freeze to death. But, and here's the inherent flaw, a triage system only works if there's actually a hospital bed available when you get to the front of the line.
Right.
In Wisconsin, the affordable housing market is so squeezed and the shelters are so packed that people are getting triaged and then just left waiting indefinitely because of what we call funding cliffs.
Let's make that concrete for the listener. The sources talk about the dairy drive encampment in Madison.
Oh, yeah. This is a classic example.
During the pandemic, the city used federal COVID relief funds to build this sanctioned campground. It had 29 mini housing structures. They were heated. They had basic facilities. It was a real lifeline.
But it costs money to run.
Right, about $70,000 a month in operational costs. And when those federal relief funds hit their expiration date in late 2025, the city just couldn't find the money in their local budget to keep it going. So they voted to shut it down, displacing everyone.
And that's a funding cliff. Municipalities launch these really effective emergency programs with federal grants, but they don't have the local tax base to sustain them once the grant dries up.
But wait, I have to push back on this a little bit.
Why?
Because there's this bizarre paradox happening in Madison.
Okay, what do you mean?
At the exact same time, they are shutting down those 29 units at Dairy Drive because they claim they're broke. They are building the Bartillion Men's Shelter, which is this massive $27 million, 250-person capacity facility.
Right.
And they're expanding a Salvation Army women's shelter. So my question is, if they have $27 million to stack the bricks and build the walls, why are they struggling to keep existing, much cheaper operations open?
Okay. This exposes the fundamental divide between capital funds and operational funds.
Meaning building it versus running it.
Exactly. Capital funds are for the physical construction, buying the land, pouring the concrete. Politicians, philanthropists, they love capital projects. You can issue a municipal bond or get a massive corporate donation, and someone gets to cut a ribbon in front of a shiny new building.
But the operational funds.
Operational funds are an entirely different beast. That's the grinding, unglamorous money you need every single year, forever. Paying the heating bill, hiring security, providing 204/7 mental health staff.
So you can find a millionaire to buy the building, but you can't get them to pay the electric bill 10 years from now.
You nailed it. And that new Bartillon shelter, it's projected to face a $4 million annual operating gap before it even opens its doors.
Wow.
Yeah, you can build all the capacity you want, but if you don't have the budget to staff it safely, it's just an empty warehouse.
Incredible. This lowers the overall picture. Based on this, the current draft score takes a hit for both housing affordability and shelter access. I mean, the rent is up 57%, and they are structurally failing to keep the lights on at these shelters.
Yeah, it's grim. But if we really want to evaluate Wisconsin fairly, we have to recognize that the urban funding crisis is only half the story.
Let's transition to the rural side then, because this brings us to a really fascinating sociological thesis from our sources by a UW-Madison researcher named Erin Godey.
Right, she spent 6 months doing ethnographic field work in 5 rural Wisconsin counties. And she outlines a profound difference between urban poverty and rural poverty.
What was the main takeaway there?
What's fascinating here is the psychological concept of visibility. So in an urban center, homelessness is hypervisible. You can't walk downtown without seeing tents under an overpass.
Yeah, or someone sleeping on a park bench.
Exactly. But in a rural, dairy-heavy county, there's no public transit to sleep on. There are virtually no formal shelters with lines outside. So rural homelessness is physically invisible. People are doubling up on a cousin's couch or living in rundown motels or camping deep in state parks.
But just because they're physically hidden doesn't mean they're unnoticed. The thesis introduces this brutal paradox she calls social hypervisibility.
Yes, the small town dynamic.
Right. In a city, you have anonymity. In a town of 2,000 people, everyone knows everyone's business. And because there aren't formal shelters, you have to rely on your local social network for help.
And the moment you ask for help, the gossip mill activates.
The examples she gives are just heart-wrenching. There's Horace Jenkins, a 52-year-old man who lost his housing and was living in his car. And he went to extreme lengths to hide it from his friends and family, purely out of small-town shame.
He was terrified of the rumors.
Yeah, he literally told the researcher he was scared the town would brand him as a lazy meth addict, which is a wildly unfair leap, but a very real fear for him.
And there was the undocumented woman, too, Tatiana Hernandez.
Yeah, 55 years old. After a huge struggle, she finally gets a low-income apartment. A service worker brings her basic move-in supplies, dish soap, a broom, laundry detergent. And instead of feeling relief, she felt deeply humiliated that the other tenants saw her receiving charity.
It just shows how stigma becomes a tangible force. It's not just that people feel bad, it's that the perceived shame actually dictates their survival strategies. They hide their cars, they reject supply drop-offs, they avoid registering for assistance.
Wow, so they just completely hide from the system.
Yeah, and this isn't just an emotional tragedy, it actually breaks the funding mechanism for the entire state.
Wait, how does small-town gossip translate to lost state funding?
Okay, so the federal government dictates funding based largely on the point-in-time count. That's a literal head count done by volunteers on a single freezing night in January. They walk the streets and count who they see.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Right. If rural individuals are terrified of being seen and are hiding deep in the woods or sleeping out of sight on a friend's floor, the volunteers log a 0.
So the data comes back artificially low.
Exactly. The federal government assumes that rural county doesn't have a problem and millions of dollars in vital funding get routed somewhere else.
Okay, let's pause here. Let's put out the draft score overlay right now. Because based on what we've covered, we're looking at a system struggling with severe urban operational gaps, compounded by a rural social stigma that literally prevents federal dollars from reaching the people who need them.
It's a rocky baseline for sure. But we still have 4 categories left, and they could radically shift this evaluation.
Let's move to the next 2. Vehicle dwelling friendliness and criminalization and enforcement.
For a lot of the unhoused population, especially the folks who are actually employed but just got priced out by that 57% rent hike, their vehicle is the absolute last line of defense.
Because it has locks, right? It keeps you out of the elements and it stores all your belongings.
Exactly. But the legality of using that last line of defense in Wisconsin is a geographic minefield.
Yeah, looking at the state laws, there isn't a blanket statewide ban on sleeping in a car. But local ordinances make it incredibly hostile. I mean, even if you drive out to a state highway rest area, which is public land designed for travelers to sleep safely, you are legally capped at a 24-hour maximum stay.
So your whole life just becomes this relentless, exhausting rotation of moving parking spots to avoid law enforcement.
And when law enforcement does step in, it gets bad. Let's look at Milwaukee's approach. They recently pushed an ordinance targeting habitual parking violators. If you accumulate 5 unpaid parking tickets that are over 60 days past due, the city can tow your vehicle.
And here's the kicker, they can tow it even if the vehicle is legally parked and fully compliant at the exact moment they find it.
Okay, let me play devil's advocate for a second. Cities have limited parking, right? If a resident is treating a public street as their permanent private driveway, racking up dozens of street sweeping tickets and ignoring them, the city has to manage that. You can't just have non-compliant vehicles blocking city services forever.
Sure, from a purely logistical standpoint, I hear that.
But practically speaking, what does towing that vehicle actually do to the person living inside it?
It accelerates their crisis exponentially. The U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness released a report on this exact dynamic. Their data proves that towing a vehicle doesn't resolve homelessness at all, it just deepens it.
Because you take their home.
You take their only shelter, yeah. But it's more than that. All of their winter clothes, their medication, and crucially, their identification documents, birth certificates, social security cards are now locked in a private impound lot.
And you can't get a job or apply for an apartment without an ID.
Precisely. And the impound fees stack up by the day. If a person couldn't afford a $40 parking ticket, they are never going to afford a $500 impound release fee. They lose the car permanently.
So the city just takes a person who is relatively safe behind a locked car door, strips them of their assets, and forces them directly onto the pavement.
That is exactly what happens. It's a revolving door of fines and poverty.
But there is a beacon of hope in this category. We have to talk about the safe parking alternative. Up in Green Bay, an organization called the Wise Women Gathering Place is running a sanctioned safe parking lot.
This is such a great program.
Right. It's a designated space where people can park and sleep overnight without the constant terror of a police knock on the window. And they go a step further. They supply the residents with heated blankets and individual power boxes to survive the winter.
Which is a profoundly humane intervention. Because a safe lot provides immediate geographical stability. If you know exactly where you are sleeping tonight, and you know you won't be towed, your nervous system can finally downregulate.
You can actually get some real sleep.
Yeah, you wake up the next morning and focus your energy on finding a job or filling out housing apps instead of spending all night in a state of hypervigilance.
So it's worth noting the vulnerability here. The Green Bay program relies heavily on private GoFundMe campaigns just to keep those power boxes running. Which brings us right back to that operational funding cliff we saw in Madison.
Always back to the operational funding.
Wow, this shifts the score in 2 different directions, really. Milwaukee's towing policy severely brings down the criminalization grade, but Green Bay's Safe Lot raises the overall picture for vehicle friendliness. It shows a compassionate approach is totally possible if the community supports it.
Which naturally leads us to our final 2 categories, outreach and social services, and pathways to permanent housing. Because safe parking is harm reduction, but it's not a permanent solution.
You need actual structural pathways out. And this is where Wisconsin actually shines with some really pragmatic innovations. Let's look at an agency called ADVO CAP. They operate in counties like Fond du Lac and Winnebago.
The Work and Wheels program.
Yes. They identified that transportation is the biggest barrier to keeping a job in rural areas. So if you're working, but you're about to lose your job because your car broke down, they step in. They offer 0% interest car loans up to $8,000 and affordable repair loans.
And they intercept the fines, too?
Right. They operate a Funds for Fines program to help low-income workers pay off the exact municipal tickets that trigger the towing policies we just talked about.
It's brilliant. They are intercepting the crisis before it cascades. But we also see the state government attempting this on a much larger macro level. The Wisconsin Department of Health Services recently executed a Medicaid 1915 state plan amendment.
Okay, wait. That sounds like impenetrable bureaucratic jargon.
It does, I know, but it is actually a revolutionary shift in how the state funds homelessness interventions.
I am genuinely confused by this one, though. Medicaid is health insurance. It pays for doctors and prescriptions. Walk me through the actual plumbing of this. How does a healthcare policy pay for housing? Is the state just mailing rent checks to landlords?
No, no. Medicaid funds cannot be used to pay direct rent. What the amendment does is acknowledge a foundational truth of public health. Housing is healthcare. You cannot effectively treat someone's severe schizophrenia or guide them through opioid withdrawal if they are sleeping under a highway overpass. It just doesn't work. So this amendment allows state agencies to use Medicaid dollars to pay for supportive housing services.
What does that actually mean in practice? Like on a Tuesday?
On a Tuesday, it means Medicaid pays the salary of the housing navigator who helps the person find an apartment. It pays for the caseworker who visits them weekly to ensure they are taking their meds, maintaining hygiene, and not violating their lease.
Oh, wow.
Historically, shelters had to beg philanthropists to fund those caseworkers' salaries. Now, because those services are recognized as vital healthcare interventions, agencies can bill Medicaid for them. It creates a sustainable, federally backed funding stream.
That is massive.
Yeah.
It treats the root cause instead of just managing the symptoms.
That's
And
good.
it pairs perfectly with the final initiative we need to score,
Right.
which targets the justice-involved population.
Right, people coming out of prison.
Yeah. If you have a felony on your record, passing a landlord's background check is virtually impossible. It funnels people straight from prison to the streets. But there's an initiative in Madison called Just Bakery, funded by the state's Skills Enhancement Grant.
Such a cool program.
It's an intensive vocational program that teaches commercial baking and business skills to folks coming out of the justice system. The state average for recidivism, meaning people reoffending and returning to prison, is an abysmal 67%.
And what's the rate for Just Bakery graduates?
It plummets to between 9 and 15%.
That is an incredibly elegant solution because you aren't just handing someone a housing voucher. You're giving them a highly marketable skill, a supportive community, and a legitimate income stream. Those are the essential building blocks for sustaining permanent housing.
So what does this all mean for our listener? Amazing, this raises the overall picture significantly. We spent a lot of time on the brutal funding cliffs and the punitive towing, but these targeted interventions like Work End Wheels and Just Bakery show a state that is creatively trying to solve the puzzle.
I think it's time to bring all these disparate pieces together and lock in our final evaluation.
Let's do it. Summarizing the state's major strengths. Wisconsin is utilizing deeply innovative funding mechanisms, mainly that Medicaid 1915 amendment bridging healthcare and housing. They have targeted grants like Just Bakery that are mathematically breaking the prison-to-homelessness pipeline. And grassroots community efforts, like Green Bay's Safe Parking Lot, provide real-world relief.
But the major weaknesses are structural and severe. You've got local criminalization policies, specifically aggressive towing ordinances in Milwaukee, that actively destroy people's last resort shelters.
Yeah.
The reliance on capital funding over sustainable operational funding means beautiful new urban shelters are facing multi-million-dollar deficits. And of course, the paralyzing social stigma in rural, dairy-heavy communities leaves thousands hiding in the shadows, totally disconnected from the safety net.
All right, let's assign the final letter grades to our 6 categories based on everything we've unpacked today. For housing affordability, the grade is a D. With rents up 57%, the pipeline into homelessness is just flowing much faster than the pipeline out.
Makes sense.
For shelter access, we arrive at a C. There is robust new construction happening in urban centers, but those operational funding cliffs render the beds highly vulnerable. For criminalization and enforcement, a D-. Using aggressive towing policies to enforce parking tickets against people living in their vehicles is actively counterproductive.
Definitely.
For vehicle dwelling friendliness, a C-. State rest stops offer a brief 24-hour reprieve, and safe lots exist in pockets like Green Bay, but they're rare and underfunded. For outreach and social services, an A-. The implementation of Medicaid to fund housing support, alongside programs providing zero-interest repair loans, are phenomenal systemic victories.
Truly.
And for pathways to permanent housing, a B. The staggering success of recidivism reduction programs proves that when permanent pathways are treated holistically, they work.
Which brings us to the final calculation for the state.
The final perfectly homeless state score for Wisconsin is a C. The state earns this grade because it is a landscape of extremes. Its localized innovations and macroeconomic Medicaid strategies are legitimately top tier. But those brilliant ideas are heavily weighed down by punitive municipal towing, a dangerous lack of shelter operations funding, and a deeply entrenched rural stigma that keeps a massive portion of its vulnerable population completely invisible.
It truly is a state of incredible paradoxes. And as we wrap up this evaluation, I want to leave you listening with one final thought to mull over. We spent a lot of time today dissecting what is visible and what is hidden.
Right.
If rural homelessness is hidden by the suffocating weight of small town stigma, and urban vehicular homelessness is hidden by the constant threat of being towed in the middle of the night,
Yeah.
what if the true staggering scale of our housing crisis isn't what we step over on the downtown sidewalks, but what we actively refuse to see in our own parking lots and peripheral social circles?
That's the Perfectly Homeless State Score for Wisconsin. Thank you for tuning in. If you find the series interesting, please tap the like and subscribe buttons. And we will see you in the next state. If you'd like to support the project, click on over to the Perfectly Homeless Etsy store and get yourself a warm hoodie with our logo, or you can buy us a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/perfectlyhomeless. Every purchase and donation helps fund future episodes in this 50-state journey through homelessness in America. Wear the logo. Start a conversation. Because homelessness isn't someone else's problem anymore. It's happening in every state, every city, and more neighborhoods than most people realize. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you think in the comment section, and I'll see you in the next episode.